supplies, forcing an end to the war before American intervention. And it almost worked. The Zimmermann Note. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from a German official named Arthur Zimmermann. The Zimmermann Note, as it's now called, proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico against the United States. In exchange, Germany would help Mexico get back Texas and other lost territories. Thankfully, Mexico declined, but the telegram was published by American newspapers, and anti-German sentiment boiled over. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war. And after 3 days of debate, the U.S. entered the Great War. Remember that they didn't know there'd be a World War II yet, so nobody called it World War I. Convoy. The U.S. helped by the Allies. Convoy. The U.S. helped the Allies by introducing the convoy system, which was sending ships across the Atlantic accompanied by warships to protect them from the U-boat attacks. Over there, the American Expeditionary Forces. The question we should think about is, what was the impact of the U.S. arrival? When the American Army, called the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John Pershing, arrived in France, it provided an influx of energy to the Allies. French and British troops were exhausted and running out of supplies, but we gave them new energy. Ready to fight. Even with a large number of volunteers, including women and African Americans, the U.S. military wasn't ready to handle such a big war. In May of 1917, the Selective Service Act started a draft for all men between the ages of 21 and 30. That meant they were supposed to go fight for our country. Black draftees were segregated from whites in the American forces, but some did go and fight with the French army, which was less discriminatory. Some of these African Americans were awarded the French Cross de Guerre, the Cross of War, a medal for their bravery. The U.S. government got supplies and funding by selling Liberty Bonds, which basically means individual citizens lent money to the government. Other things that helped the United States. We set up the War Industries Board to manage the distribution and production of supplies. And then the National War Labor Board was set up to settle conflicts with unions without strikes. Another thing we did was urging people to save resources through the Fuel Administration and food through the Food Administration. We also encouraged citizens to plant victory gardens so that a higher percentage of the food from the larger farms could go to the soldiers. The U.S. had to work hard to produce enough food and supplies for its own army and its allies. Why did we have to help the Allies, too? We'll answer that question later. The home front. The U.S. government had to deal with a labor shortage, with young men away fighting, women, immigrants, and Africans. African Americans got access to jobs they couldn't get before. Public opinion, another thing they had to deal with. The Committee on Public Information was created to deal with this. They created propaganda about German atrocities, the horrible things the Germans did to keep the American people riled up. And it worked. But it also encouraged anti-German American discrimination. Limiting criticism. President Wilson signed into law the Espionage Act, which included specific penalties for spies. And he also enacted the Sedition Act, making it illegal to express negative thoughts about the government. Many pacifists, people who wanted peace, and socialists were jailed because of this, including Eugene V. Debs. In 1919, the Supreme Court case of Schneck versus the United States, the court ruled that limitations on free speech were valid in a time of war. The Sedition Act was passed during World War I, The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in 1798. Both of them made sedition, or going against the government, illegal. 14 points. On January 8, 1918, well before the war ended, President Wilson justified why the U.S. was going to war and gave a set of specific goals. He also informed Congress that this was, quote, the war to end all wars, and he had made a plan to prevent another major war. The plan became known as the 14 Points. Here they are. No secret treaties and alliances, freedom of navigation on the seas, equality of trade, smaller militaries, an adjustment of colonial claims, the evacuation and restoration of the Russian territory, the evacuation and restoration of Belgian territory, the evacuation and restoration of French territory, the evacuation of the German armies, a readjustment of the Italian borders, an autonomy for the people of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, giving them their own self-governance, the evacuation and restoration of the Balkan Peninsula, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, autonomy for the Ottoman Empire, and the establishment of an independent Poland, and, last but not least, a League of Nations, an organization of countries working together to resolve disputes. Meanwhile, the Russian Revolution. The Russians had taken huge casualties, and the country was struggling. In March of 1917, the Russian Revolution began. Tsar Nicholas II, the ruler of Russia, was forced to step down. The interim, or new, democratic government that replaced him failed to help with the food shortages and the low morale. Then